For more on Africa's diverse economies, I spoke to Raymond Gilpin. He's Dean of the Africa Centre for Strategic Studies at the National Defence University. I began by asking whether the continent benefited from the Paris climate talks.
I think it's a good start. The challenge then becomes how do we translate all the pledges into programs and policies that benefit the African producers, because part of the issue is that a lot of the production in Africa is not as climate friendly as it should be. Also, a lot of the domestic consumption in terms of cooking and heating are also not as climate friendly. So the challenge now is not so much with the Paris talks, is with how do the African governments ensure that both the consumers and the producers in African countries benefit from these pledges.
You're talking, I think, about trying to bring new infrastructure in place that is more climate friendly when you've got some countries where people are cooking predominantly on cook stoves that create lots of small scale pollution. That's a huge challenge, though, to try and change people's ways of living and changing infrastructure.
Absolutely. I think it's a huge challenge, and one of the things that gives me a lot of hope is that the African economy and the African people have demonstrated over the last decade an incredible resilience and a capacity to leapfrog technology. We've seen Africa go from no phones to cell phones everywhere, and I don't think that it's far-fetched to anticipate, given the right conditions and also a lot of support, them going from cooking and cook stoves to natural gas, which is abundant on the continent.
I often think when we use the term Africa economy, it might be harmful. We're talking about a continent with 50 countries or so that are so diverse. Do you think it potentially is harmful for people outside of this continent to sort of look at it as one big block?
Absolutely, because the continent is so diverse. The harm being that when we think about Africa as one whole, we think about Africa as we see in the death, disease, and destruction narrative. The last United Nations Development Programme Index shows that almost 1/3 of African countries are not in the low development category. They're either middle or higher income. There is diversity there. You have the oil-producing and the non-oil producing countries, a lot of diversity there as well. And you have some countries that have more welcoming investment climates and some that do not. And so when you look at Africa as a cohesive whole, you're missing the diversity that is actually potentially its strength.
When we talk about different African economies, we often hear that the real problems are transport, communication, the lack of airlines that are crisscrossing the continent to serve countries. We talk also about infrastructure being a problem, particularly in telecoms. If you could fix one problem across the whole continent tomorrow, which would you pick, transport or communications?
I'll pick transport because the continent has a huge infrastructure deficit. Some have really, really big numbers about how much investment is going to need. The continent is going to need to bring people to markets, goods to people. And I think that we've seen a lot of investment already going into the telecommunications sector, one of Africa's really, really high growth sectors, but not enough on the as far as infrastructure for transportation and transportation networks are concerned. And so I think that if we have more roads connecting people to places of production and connecting those places to markets, we're going to see not just an increase in growth, but we're going to see a lot more distribution of the wealth of the continent.
And specifically, which part of Africa needs roads, needs airports more than any other?
I think the largest deficit is currently felt in West Africa, but across the board, we need a lot more connectivity. And one of the reasons why very little of the value of international trade remains on the continent is that you just don't have that connectivity. You think about the value chain for the most of Africa's exports. They basically bypass lots of towns, lots of cities that could be integrated into this value chain and provide services and support.
We know Islamic State has been making huge gains across parts of North Africa. Libya, for example, is often cited by politicians in Europe as being the danger point. Is there any one country in Africa that's in trouble that worries you more than others?
I think Libya would be it, not just because of the fact that state institutions are practically non-existent and the insecurity continues to deepen and persist, but the fact that it's already exporting not just people but dangerous ideology. State institutions have failed the people, and non-state entities are filling the gap. Some of them filling the gap in a positive way, in others it's in a negative way. And I think the most important thing, even more important than radical ideology, is reconnecting communities and people and the governments that are supposed to serve them. And I think that, for me, is the greatest challenge on the continent.